Good evening and welcome to the Kelleher MacLeod pre-concert talk. I'm Brent Stevens of Classical 95.5 KHFM. A pleasure to welcome you here. I put on this jacket and I was going through the pocket and I had tickets from the Santa Fe Opera and from the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival. But this is the first chance to see a season concert of this best band on the Rio Grande. So welcome to the first concert. And please welcome to the stage violinist Jennifer Frauci and conductor Rune Bergman.
I'll let you sing that. Hello.
So we're going to start with the Prokofiev Violin Concerto, written last in order. Prokofiev was well-traveled at this point. He was living in Paris, and I think the Soviets were trying to get him to come back. And he even wrote that I think he wrote the concerto in many different places. He started in Paris. He was in some of the Soviet bloc countries for a while, and then it ended up being premiered in Spain. Does his travel reflect itself in the music, do you think?
Absolutely. One thing to keep your ear on is that in the last movement, the third movement, he introduces the maraca, which gives it a little bit of a, even though I think of this as being a very Russian piece, there's this little bit of Spanish flair that gets introduced in the last movement. So keep the principal theme of the last movement, which comes back several times. Listen for the maracas there because it gives this different color, I think, and character. And I think that one of the important things to remember or to keep in mind about this piece is that he wrote it around the same time that he was composing his Romeo and Juliet. And for those of you who are familiar with that, there's so much great lyrical, lush love music in Romeo and Juliet, and you hear some of that in this concerto as well.
Yeah, in fact, the sketchbooks for that piece and this date back to, I think, the early 1930s. So he'd been having these themes and melodies and ideas playing around in his head for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
The piece, I don't want to sound out of place, but I think of the great violin concertos, and I think of Beethoven, and I think of Brahms and Mendelssohn, and then, and Prokofiev second, of course. It's not played as much. Why not? Because it's such a lovely piece.
Well, it is. I think it is programmed with some frequency, but there is no piece written in the 20th century that's programmed as much as the blockbuster, popular,
romantic concertos,
concerti, and I think that's true pretty much of the piano concerto repertoire too, except for maybe Prokofiev's third concerto, which is programmed a lot, right? But there are certain pieces from the 20th and 21st century now, which are popular, but I think in terms of your mass audience for classical music, I think the romantic repertoire is the most popular. So that's why it doesn't get programmed as often. I think that's just the simple answer.
And it's such a gorgeous piece for violin. Talk a bit, if you will, about the way he uses the instrument. The beginning with it seems to be a real kind of Russian feel to the low string.
Yeah, I think the opening theme has a somewhat dark, slightly brooding quality. It's based. Has a Russian flavor to it, wouldn't you say? Yeah. But he really exploits the extremes of the instrument. So he starts at the very lowest register of the instrument, and there's a lot of writing down in the very deepest, darkest, richest part of the instrument, which is the lowest string. But then there's a lot of the melodic writing. He writes these soaring melodies that go up to the very stratosphere of the instrument, the very high soprano range as well. And he uses everything in between. And there's, as I said, there's this very lush melodic writing, but constantly juxtaposed with much more angular, acerbic, rhythmic writing that in the orchestra as well. So there's this constant in the first movement in particular, but in all three movements, this interplay between this very horizontal, broad lushness and much more vertical, rhythmic hard driving music.
And Rune, part of that is the orchestration that he uses, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very exciting orchestration, and I mean, we can't forget that the piece is kind of difficult to play. So that's, I mean, every piece has their challenges, but it's really, here you have the melodic challenges that you have in the romantic, but you also have the huge virtuosity that is needed, and I mean, you can really have something to look forward to tonight. It will be amazing.
So no pressure on you, of course.
No pressure at all.
None felt.
When you're playing a piece like this, the second movement is so gorgeous, the melody with the pizzicato strings. I don't want to get all airy-fairy about it, but do images come to your mind and your heart as you play them? That does it bring up images or certain emotions for you? No, you. Or you too, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, this music is so characterful, and so in this particular piece, each section, each melody, I think more in terms of descriptive words or adjectives that define the character of that section. I mean, there's other music that I play where I have much more strong visual imagery, but for this piece, there are everything, you know, the character is so sharply defined. I don't necessarily relate it to a narrative where I see a tableau unfolding in front of me.
You're not walking through the woods and seeing the little robin in the trees, or
I am.
There are pieces like Sibelius Concerto, for example, where I have very strong visual imagery that it conjures up. There is some of that, but it's much more, I'd say, feeling and character based.
Is there a lot of research for you, not only when you're learning a piece and when you play it over and over, not into just the technical parts of the piece, but about the composer, the history of the composition, the time when it was composed?
Of course, that plays a large part in interpreting and understanding any given work, and also where a given work falls within the timeline. We're talking about a violin concerto now, so within the timeline of the history of violin concerto and how it relates to pieces that came before it and what influenced it. So that all that very much takes a shape in all of our interpretations, understanding where the composer was coming from, what was happening historically at that point, not related to music, and also what the musical currents were that came before and afterwards. And so, I mean, in this particular case, what's interesting historically is that, as you pointed out at the very beginning of our talk, Prokofiev had spent quite a long time away from Russia, and he was in the States, in New York, and then he lived in Paris for over a decade. And this was just at the point where he was about to return home, and he was very much looking at his homeland. And so I think that affects the character and the flavor of the music compositionally, in that there's, if you look at his first violin concerto, which was written, I think 18 years before that, it has much less of what I'd call a Russian feeling to it. And this concerto, it's, as portends his returning home and settling back in Russia.
And he had both good and bad times when he returned to Russia. Prokofiev at some points was lionized by the Soviets, and at other points he sat on his doorstep wondering when they were going to come and take him away. So it's quite an emotional ride for him. What kind of a violin do you play?
I play on a 1722 Stradivarius that's on loan to me. It's been a long-term loan, so I've had it for a long time, and it's I'm very fortunate to have it. It's 1722 is very late in Stradivarius's career. He actually lived into his 90s, and people often ask me how many Strads are there out there in the world, and people are surprised by the answer, because he started making violins as an apprentice in his teens and actually kept making into his 90s. So that meant that he had a good 70 plus years of making instruments, and he was quite prolific. I mean, he was a workhorse who made a lot of instruments. So right now there are roughly 600 of his instruments extant, including some violas and cellos, but largely the bulk of those are violin.
And what kind of bow?
I play on a French, I have a couple, but tonight I'll be playing on a Grande Dame. It's a French bow, which belonged to the concertmaster of the Berlin Phil, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he passed away about 5 years ago, and he was a concertmaster Berlin through the 90s.
And why would you change bows? Just
people are often fascinated by the instrument, and why is the Strad so, why are they so famous, or what's different about them, and there is something about the quality and the range of colors that you can get out of a Stradivarius, which is very unique and special, I think. But I actually think that the bow makes a bigger difference, and it's something that people aren't as aware of, because usually when you're watching a violinist, you're more focused on the instrument that they're playing, or a cello, of course. It's so fascinating to look at the beautiful shape of that instrument. But the bow really affects the range of colors you can get, the projection. There's a huge difference in just this simple stick, and how much projection you can get out of an instrument, and how much you can articulate, how much you can play legato and sing, and it's amazing that this very thin piece of flexible wood would make such a big difference from bow to bow. And so what's interesting is to hear a bunch of different bows back to back, and then you hear actually the difference. You're playing on the same violin, but you take 3 different bows, and one bow might have a much more piercing sound, another bow might have a much fatter sound, some just sound louder, others are very... So to answer your question, why would I change bows? There's certain bows that are more well-suited, for example, to Baroque music or to classical music that have a lighter feel to them, and then there's others. The bow that I'm using tonight for the Prokofiev, it's a very, there's a lot of digging in that's required, and this bow really I dig in, but the bow actually digs in. Like, you just put it on the string and it goes, argh.
So you're lucky enough to land a Strad, but you've got to audition all the bows that really bring the sound out of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also the compatibility. There's certain bows that go with certain violins and other bows that don't go with other violins.
So it's not just walking down the street and the guy says, hey, I got a bow you'd like to try.
Yeah. No, it's very particular to the instrument. So.
We are going to let Miss Frauchi go because she's on first, and it's not a routine. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy the concert.
It was funny, we were discussing my conducting batons earlier today.
Were you really?
And it's not as expensive as a violin bow, but it does really make a difference also with how much it weighs and stuff like that. So it's a totally different price class, but it's...
Are they all made of fiberglass, or are there...
No, there are like in fiberglass and 100 of types of different woods. And it depends which kind of lightness you want in it. And of course, when you're conducting for many hours, for instance, a Wagner opera, you can really feel it in the shoulders if it's too heavy. It doesn't have to be heavy at all, but when you do this for hours.
Really?
So we had a discussion about that earlier.
So we should watch and see if you're sort of drooping towards the end of the concert.
Yes. So if I start to get heavy, I need to go and change to a lighter one.
Is it like a baseball player? Do you swing a heavy baton first, and then when you go on stage, it seems lighter?
If it's Bruckner, we have to go with heavy stuff. It depends.
So let's talk about Tchaikovsky. The Fifth Symphony, there were 10 years between the Fourth Symphony and the Fifth Symphony, during which time he wrote the Violin Concerto, his opera Eugene Onegin, the 1812 Overture, the beautiful Serenade for Strings. And by the time he got to this, which I think was 1888, he told somebody that he was afraid he was played out as a composer, and it was very difficult work for him. But does that show in the piece?
No, I don't think it shows there. Probably, maybe he was searching, because this symphony is a little bit more searching for colors than many of the others. So maybe he had it in mind. But I think that when it actually was premiered and it wasn't like a huge success, I think he just very quickly said to himself, "Oh no, I couldn't do that. I can't do it anymore. This was not a success." But of course, I think it had a lot to do with his mental issues and everything that happened around it. And as you said, the things he composed before. What is interesting that you can listen tonight is actually the third movement. If you know the Nutcracker, you will immediately find some colors there that I think he copied a little bit when he wrote that 4 or 5 years ago.
The third movement is the waltz movement,
yes,
right?
Yes, So it's interesting. I get usually asked, like, because I do a quite light waltz. So is this Russian enough? Is this serious enough? And even though you're Russian, you don't necessarily have to be angry or serious all the time. And I think that these things, that the colors that you can later hear in the Nutcracker, was actually, he started thinking on that. As you said, he had many thoughts on his mind at the same time.
I think one of the great things about the Russian music, especially of Tchaikovsky, is there is a deep melancholy to it, but there's such a sense of humor right at the surface that just wants to spring out at you. There's a joy in life, I think.
Yeah, and I think that what's special with this symphony, they're all great, but I think this symphony has everything. And that is probably why it wasn't like immediate success. It wasn't easy, accessible enough. It's kind of, you had to take it in a way. And if we go back to time with Mozart, Haydn, when lots of music was written as purely entertainment, background music, you didn't have to kind of take it in the same way. This symphony, if you really open up tonight, I think you'll find every pain, every victory, every joy you have felt through the life. And I think he went through that in that symphony, in everything, in every way.
So this wasn't successful, even though I think is it the third movement, the Andante Cantabile, that's one of the most gorgeous melodies I think Tchaikovsky ever wrote.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is like, it's such a beautiful melody, everything of it. But I think it was, I mean, some said that they think he overwrote it in a way that from the one melody to the next one and the next one, he spent too much time going around it. And they thought he did that just to make it longer. The symphony.
Like he got paid by the page or something?
Maybe he got better paid. But when I see it, it's so interesting because when you open the score, the clarity of the score to be a romantic piece, I think it's very, I have to go back to Mozart actually to see such a clear score. And I think sometimes this symphony can be done a little bit over romantic. That because there are many curves that you can really spend a lot of time, and you can slow down, and you can spend forever on it. But at least when I look at the score, I see a very clear line of it, and the curves that he wants to spend more time on, he's marked it. So I try to, actually, in my interpretation, it's probably a little bit more clear. I think actually a little bit Mozart clarity in this. And of course, then some curves you will notice when it happens.
And I think one of the contemporary criticisms of the fourth movement was that it essentially is just a rhythmic drive. Whether it's, despite the dynamic difference, it just drives and drives and drives to the end.
Yeah, and that can be performed in so many ways. If you just do it very staccato and just keep it going as a rhythmical pattern, it can sound both angry and, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to have a direction. We have been practicing this week to get I call it the Schwung. That's from my days in Germany, the Schwung. And that's when you kind of feel that it goes, the music flies away. And even if it's bum, 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 if you keep a direction on that, the music starts flying in a totally different way. So we have a more flying approach than the angry approach today.
Schwung. Okay.
Schwung. It was funny because I was working with opera houses in Germany for many years, and I mean, when you have short time, you have to just do it quick. So it was funny because I had two things I said to them: play more charming and they got that, so they were really excited about that. And then I said, oh, this needs to be more schwung in it, and they got that as well. So that was my quick way of rehearsing Germany.
And now bringing that to New Mexico. We would like to open it up for questions for a few minutes, if anyone has any. And if we could maybe bring up the house lights a little bit so I can see what's going on. We have one down here in the front row, and Mansell is going to be running around to try and stuff a mic in your face.
I was wondering if you'd like to talk about the point that came up about 19th century concerti tending to be more popular now than ones from the 20th century and the 21st century. Would you say that's something having to do with, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, are the 19th century concerti more relevant somehow than the ones from the early 20th century?
Yeah, I think it has to do with many things. Of course, they are a little bit older, so then they have been there for a while. And then it's been kind of course, everybody loves them. They are beautiful and all that. But I think this concerto we will hear today, the challenge is that you have to do all the romantic stuff. As a violinist, you have to do it really well. You have to know how to do that. And then you have to add a really, like Jennifer said, dig in way of playing as well. So it's so much more technically challenging also. So I think that is, I mean, there are probably many reasons that this concerto is not played too often, but I would say, I think many violinists try to avoid it in a way, actually, to be honest, because it's not the easiest to play. And
but I think that also, you could say that of a lot of repertoire, that the repertoire of the 19th century tends to be more popular with audiences, and then there are pieces that are very popular for a while and fade, and even if the Beethoven Violin Concerto was essentially a dud and lost until Mendelssohn revived it at the Gewandhaus. So even the concertos now that we consider among the greatest weren't necessarily well thought of in their time. It could be that the right artist, the right recording, the right tour, and this concerto would enter the repertoire and become something that everybody wants to hear and loves.
We'll change everything tonight.
That's right.
You
it
will
starts
love
right here, right now. Anyone else? Oh, come on. Somebody's got to have a question. It's Russian music. Everybody loves Russian music. Down here. Wait, we're running a mic down to you.
For the conductor, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a conductor?
Oh, wow. How much time do we have? It's so the very short story, because it's a long and strange story, but the short story is that somehow I came from a tiny, tiny place. It's only 8,000 people live there. And I had something dragged me towards classical music, even though I wasn't exposed to it. So when my parents, sometimes on Saturdays, they gave me some money so I could buy some candy or something. Believe it or not, I didn't spend it on candy. I do now. But at that time, I saved them and I started buying recordings. And I remember the first one I bought was Beethoven First and Second Symphony. It was amazing. And then I was about 8 years old, and my father woke me up and said, there is a concert on TV, if you want to have a look. And I went in, and it was the New Year's concert from Vienna. And if you know the conductor Carlos Kleiber, he was extremely famous at the time, and he did the Fledermaus Overture by Strauss. And even though I was so young, I think I saw 10 seconds of it, and I turned to my parents and said, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. Probably they thought I was crazy, and they probably was right. But after that, it was a very long journey. The long journey from a small place with 8,000 people and until the stages I have today. But it's been a very interesting journey.
Anyone else? How many? Is this your second or third time with the New Mexico?
Oh, it's the second time, but it feels like it's the 10th time. We kind of just we're starting where we left off the last time, so it's been great to be back. And I think it's exactly 1 year ago I was sitting here.
When you're choosing the repertoire for the concert, Do you give a list of what you would like to conduct, and then the orchestra says, we would like to see this, or?
Oh, I think it's as many possibilities as there are orchestras, but usually it works like maybe the orchestra has something special they want to do. Like this time, the orchestra really wanted to play the Prokofiev Second. So then we kind of talk together, see what would go well with that, what would work, what could be a good fit. So it's always, I try to bring something that is new and more well-known, and something that challenge both on and off the stage. So it's kind of a cooperation all the time. We just talk and see what happens.
So this program started, the genesis of it was that you were going to do the second violin, violin?
Yeah. And I had a concert at a different place last week, and there was only one piece they needed to play, and that was a Mozart piece. So they said so they kind of felt, maybe we can do some Beethoven. So which Beethoven do you want to do of the symphonies, they asked me. I said, choose anyone between 1 and 9. I love them all. So it did.
And if they don't have a chorus available, that at least narrows it down. Well, I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Kelleher and MacLeod for sponsoring the concert talks. And you're going to hear a lot about this, but I would also like to remind you that this Russian program is the beginning of a wonderful week with the New Mexico Philharmonic and the Olga Kern International Piano Competition. 23 soloists from all around the world, from Moscow, from Europe, one here from Albuquerque. There are 2 free days of concerts all day, Tuesday and Thursday, at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Those are the prelims. Everybody gets to take a night off and breathe. $10 to attend the semifinal round on Thursday. Then 3 of those contestants will be back here on this stage next Saturday night. A great concert to hear, 3 piano concertos, and then the final 4 piano concertos? 4, really? Wow.
Wow.
4 finalists. That's a great evening. And then the next day will be the awards ceremony and the finalists recital back at the Journals Theater at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. You can find out more at olgakerninternationalcompetition.org. You can also find out more at the New Mexico Philharmonic's website. Boy, if you want to dig in, this is going to be a great week for music, and I will look forward to seeing you back here in 1 week. Thank you very much.